Hello, my name is Sosinna Lemma. I have nearly 20 years of experience working in the development sector with a wide range of experience in capacity development, program management, gender-based violence program, gender-based violence program, and safeguarding. Currently, I am working as a safeguarding technical lead for one of the multi-donor civil society program, and I'm a regional associate for Africa for RSH. I will be your host for this webinar. Welcome to the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hubs webinar on robust and risky recruitment. Before we start the webinar, a few points on housekeeping. First, you are all in mute with your video turned off. This is to support with the quality and connection of the webinar. Second, if you have any issues with tech or otherwise, you can write to us in the chat function and one of us will help you. Please be aware that we are recording this webinar for anyone who was not able to join. This and the slides will be available on online hub afterward. Please be assured that your name will not be visible on the recording. The purpose of the Safeguarding Resource and Support Hub is to support organizations in the aid sector to strengthen their safeguarding policy practice against sexual exploitation, abuse, and sexual harassment. As part of this, we run a webinar series discussing some of the key issues affecting those of us working in the safeguarding and protection of sexual exploitation and harassment. Recruitment has been identified as a key factor making our organization safer for everyone. All too often, we fail to identify individuals who are not safe to work with children and risk at people during our recruitment process, or we see perpetrators being hired and rehired in the sector. At the 2018 Safeguarding Summit in London, the humanitarian and development sector committed to improving this process. Several initiatives were also launched, including Project Sotoria, which focus on using Interpol's tools and services to enable international law enforcement coordination and to support wider efforts to limit access of sexual offender to aid sector position. The aid worker registration scheme, which will provide accurate work history linked to personal identity, and the misconduct disclosure scheme, which we'll hear more about in this webinar. This is of a particular interest for us here in Ethiopia because we have set up a working group to see how we can make this work in the Ethiopian context. This webinar will explore further how we can move from risky to robust recruitment practice. We have two speakers for you today. First, we will go through Sarah Maguire, who is DAI's Global Director of Safeguarding, who will look at the issue around recruitment, how we can collaborate to create a pool of good practice. Then we have Gareth Price-Jones, who will talk us through the interagency misconduct scheme that he leads on. We will then end the webinar with a live Q&A session. If you would like to ask any question during the two presentations, you can find the Q&A function in the control panel on the bottom of your screen. You can add any question or upvote any existing question, and we will try to answer as many of them at the end. The chat will remain open, so please add comments or share your experience in there. Before I hand over to Sarah for her presentation, a bit about her background. Sarah Maguire is a DAI Global Director of Safeguarding. Before taking her current position, Sarah was director of the governance team in DAI's UK office. Sarah started her humanitarian rights career as a practitioner, barrister in criminal defense, immigration, asylum, and family law before entered into the field of international development. She has more than 20 years of experience at the country level, most in conflict-affected and fragile states, and international and policy experience with governments, non-government organizations, and United Nations entities. Sarah has worked mainly across South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Over to you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Susana. There's just one thing I really think I ought to add to that very kind bio that you've just presented, which is about being a human rights and feminist activist. And the more one thinks about safeguarding and SEAH, it's so important to remember that these things are not accidents. They are located within power imbalances. They are located within endemic discrimination against particularly women and girls. So I just sort of wanted to supplement the more formal stuff with that. What I'll be doing in my presentation, short presentation, is to give, I'm not going to give you the answers, I'm afraid, but what I am going to do is surface a few of the main problems that people have been identifying, and to find out from people here what great initiatives or struggles that you've had, things that have gone well, things that have not gone well, and how we can work together. And Susana mentioned the big C word, collaboration. And really, I think it's become obvious to us all that this is at the heart of preventing sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. So we can start. Thank you very much. What's the problem? You know, every time we look at a situation, either the big scandals, the Haiti, the DRC, and others, Nepal, we can look at them as things that happen, or we can look at them as human rights violations that are perpetrated by real people. And every one of those real people has been recruited and retained by organizations whose job it is to do good, not to do harm. And so I just really wanted to locate us in that. Like, why are we talking about recruitment? Is because that's where the rubber hits the road. That's the reality. We know that perpetrators can be determined to find and use loopholes. So there's the opportunistic perpetrators, the ones who happen to find themselves in a humanitarian crisis or in a development context and take advantage of their situation, use the opportunities that are presented. There are also perpetrators who set out to perpetrate sexual exploitation and abuse, usually. And those ones are determined to find and use loopholes. And so it's our job to close those loopholes and to prevent the impunity that these perpetrators are facing. The last thing really to say on this introductory note is that they don't wear labels. The guy who is, he's Mr. Lovely, he's, probably active in his field, he's been very kind to people. Those are as likely, I'm afraid, to be perpetrators of sexual exploitation and abuse as anyone else. And so, when we're looking at how to prevent our organizations recruiting and retaining these people, we have to be aware that there is no appearance. They don't wear a label. Thank you. So on a very broad brush level, what do we need to do? What are we actually talking about doing? What we're talking about doing here is kicking out perpetrators and making sure they don't get back in. That's to our own organisations. And then the next bit is to prevent them moving around between organisations. We know, for instance, that a lot of perpetrators who have been working in one organisation and then are kicked out of that organisation or leave while there's an investigation going on, have fantastic CVs. They appear to be very well skilled. They may be excellent health professionals or governance experts or whatever. And so they will be in demand. So our job then is to prevent them from moving around between our organisations. And the third thing we really need to do is actively tackle impunity. It's not good enough to say, oh, well, he left. Well, you know, we solved the problem because he was no longer working with us. We separated him from our project or from our organisation, because he will go on and do it again somewhere else. And it probably isn't the first time that he's done it. If we've got to the point of an investigation, you can be almost certain that that person has not been doing it for the first time. Next, please. Okay, I'm going to ask you all in a second to do a quick poll on some of the concrete problems that we all face. I'm not going to read these out for you because everybody can do that, and we don't want to waste our time on that. But we're going to give you a poll to see which of these problems, the top 3 of these problems, you think that you're facing within your organisation. You might have to scroll down to get all of the problems. It's anonymous, obviously. We don't know. You know, nobody's going to go, oh, that organisation, we know that they've particularly got an issue with that particular problem. So if everyone can just take a few minutes, a few seconds really, just to identify the top 3, and then we'll have a look and see which of these is the most common. And if you have a question about any of these questions, then just pop it in the chat and I can answer it for you. Okay, I think everyone's probably had enough time to think about that. Can we see the results of that poll? So this is interesting. We have pressure to deliver at speed has been identified by 60% of people on this call as one of the major problems that are faced. And another one is self-selected references. I'm going to come on in a little bit to a possible answer to that problem. And then we see people who lie, and that I know is something that is going to be addressed by Gareth shortly on the misconduct disclosure scheme, and is also a subject of an initiative led by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office on making sure, called the Aid Worker Registration Scheme, to make sure that people actually are honest about what organisations they've been working for. Project-based recruitment and the fact of working in different jurisdictions with different employment or labour laws is obviously a major issue as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for that. I think it's probably interesting for us all to see what are the main issues, and also quite reassuring to know that we're not, each one of us is not alone in facing these issues. So what can we do to start with this? Again, the C word, collaboration, and really breaking out of a bureaucratic approach, the approach that says, well, this is how we do things, so this is how we do things, and we can't take the risk. So, for instance, we hear from people sometimes saying, well, we can't take the risk that we might be sued for sharing information between organisations. And so really we have to start thinking, what's the bigger risk? What's the risk if we do? And what's the risk if we don't? And the risk isn't just to ourselves as organisations, the risk is to the very people for whom we get up in the morning. We also have to be really honest internally about how our processes allow perpetrators to stay or get rehired, or to move around. That involves some quite introspective and sometimes quite painful discussions within our own organisations, and we have to be prepared to do that as a shared problem rather than as a blame. Next slide, please. So again, I'm going to ask everybody to come up with a few ideas in a minute, but I just want to sort of outline a few of the concrete things that we can do. Now, we identified people selecting self-selected references as an issue. And one of the things that we've been trying to do within DAI's UK practice is to say to people, thank you for applying to us. We need to take some references from you before we can finalise your contract. And then instead of saying, oh, can you give me your three best mates who can tell you what a fabulous person you are and how safe you are to work with, that we say to them, we want you to tell us every job you've done for the last 3 years, or the last 3 jobs, whichever goes back furthest, with a reference supplied for each of those positions, and we will choose which ones that we go to for a reference. What that also does is signal to the prospective employee that we're not a pushover and that we are going to apply our zero tolerance policies. Including safeguarding questions in recruitment processes can be very easy to do, surprisingly, and can, as well as signalling, can also give the people who are doing recruitment, whether that's on projects or at headquarter level, a real chance to just sort of get under the skin of how somebody responds. Number F there, enlisting the support of our clients and donors for safe recruitment and retention. The pressure that everybody, or that most people, a lot of people identified there about getting stuff done at speed. It's not just done in humanitarian crises, that can also be clients who want to put pressure because, for instance, the project is having a high rate of turnover, or it's in a situation of a pandemic, for instance. So really what we need to be enlisting the support of our clients, and ideas about how we can do that will be great. And then, of course, the last one there, asking the women and girls in communities. They know what will make them want to report someone. They know what the opportunities are for sexual exploitation and abuse. And the more we ask the people, particularly the women and the girls who are victims of sexual exploitation and abuse, the more answers we're going to get. So I think we've got another poll. So for people to identify, in your view, the 3 most important, or the things that are most likely to have impact. And again, you're going to have to scroll down, and again, this is anonymous. So you can just take a couple of seconds, each of you, to just tick the 3 that you think is going to be the most valuable. Okay, can we have the results of the poll then? Okay, interesting again. So just going to scroll down to see. So again, vast majority of people think that improving reference checking is one of the most important things that we can do, followed pretty equally by the speak out culture, signalling zero tolerance at the earliest stages of recruitment, and including safeguarding questions in the recruitment processes. What I'm reading from that is that we need to be really active about this, very deliberate, very intentional about saying to people, if you want to come and work with us, these are the things that you have to do. You will be expected to give better references for us to check. You will be expected to answer a safeguarding question. You will be expected to understand right from the very beginning the sort of organisation we are, and that we're not going to give you a safe haven for sexual exploitation and abuse. Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. So next is to really think about sort of what ideas that people on this conversation have, and that could be things that you've already tried or things that you haven't tried yet but you'd love to try, things that have gone well for you. You know, are you using a particular system within your organisation or your body of organisations? So, for instance, you know, is there a database that's being held, and things that you've tried that haven't gone so well, so that we can all learn and not have to repeat each other's mistakes. So I think we were going to ask people to share your experiences and ideas in the chat, but also when we've had the discussion from Gareth on the misconduct disclosure scheme, then we're going to open up for a more of an actual conversation. So probably while Gareth is talking, then we can start just populating the chat, coming up with a few ideas. And I see that already people are starting to contribute, which is brilliant. And Lucy, I think, is going to sort of collate and highlight the top ones, or the ones that come up most often.
Susanna, did you want to come in there, or shall I kick off?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. In her presentation, Sarah mentioned concrete problems we all face in recruitment, and some concrete things we can do to mitigate them. Next, we have Gareth Price-Jones. Gareth is Executive Secretary of the Steering Committee on Humanitarian Response. Since his first field deployment in 2001, Gareth has gained over 19 years senior experience in 11 countries, mainly in Asia, and has led INGO operational response in a number of contexts, including the 2005 Asian tsunami, the 2010 Haiti earthquake, and Syria conflict. He's currently based in Geneva. Gareth leads the interagency misconduct disclosure scheme, which prevents abusive staff move between humanitarian organizations. Gareth, you can continue your presentation. Thank you. I was disconnected. Thank you.
Thanks, Susanna. Yeah, so next slide, please. So many of you may have heard of the Misconduct Disclosure Scheme. We've been running it for over a year now. But I want to really boil it down to the basics. It's really not rocket science, and the scheme consists of two main commitments. The first one is a commitment to systematically check with previous employers about any SEA issues. So when you're hiring someone, you commit to systematically making those checks. And then the second part is a commitment to respond systematically to those checks from others. A couple of other points to highlight is there's no centralized database, and I'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through, but there's no centralized database of misconduct or of staff. It does potentially complement the aid worker registration scheme that was mentioned earlier, but within the misconduct disclosure scheme, there's no database. And we also emphasize quite strongly that it doesn't necessarily give you a yes or no answer. What it does is give you better information to make a hiring decision. So that's really, really critical. Next slide, please. So the scale, we gather information on the scheme at the end of each year, each calendar year. So we're expecting new figures in January. But at the end of 19, just in its first very incomplete year of implementation, the scheme had already impacted on over 3,500 recruitments, with in over 2,900 requests for data being made. And importantly, over 2,000 sets of misconduct data had been provided, and by both those organisations that signed up to the scheme, but also by organisations that hadn't signed up to the scheme. So that for us was a really useful indicator that actually the design of the scheme is working for agencies that haven't necessarily signed up to it. Next slide, please. So we've also had a big increase since then in the number of implementing organisations. So just this last week of November, we now have 2 more signatory organisations. So we're up to 62 now since I shared these slides. So really getting good engagement from a wide range of agencies. Also, of those implementing, many have recorded that they've improved the systematization of the scheme. So maybe if we can just jump back a slide. You can see here that there's clearly a challenge in the first year because the scheme was covering 3,700 recruitments, but only 2,900 requests for misconduct data had been made. And the scheme commits you to checking back for the last 5 years. So you'd expect an average of maybe 2 or 3 requests per recruitment, and we're clearly not there yet. So in its first year, the scheme wasn't being implemented systematically. What we're hoping with the 2020 data is that it's much more systematic. We're also in the final stages of welcoming new types of implementing organisations. So that includes our first donor, our first UN agencies, and also private sector contractors as well. But we're still looking for our first local implementing organisations. So we have several NGOs INGOs that are implementing through their local country offices. But one of our aims of the scheme was to make sure that anyone could implement it. One of our concerns was that if bigger organisations get better at making these checks, as Sarah shared with us earlier, the worry is that offenders and perpetrators would move to smaller organisations. So we wanted to make sure with the design of the scheme from the outset that it addressed those issues. Next slide, please. So why do we need the scheme? Well, as Sarah shared with us earlier, there's strong anecdotal and case evidence that we're hiring people with known previous misconduct. This isn't people who it's the first time they've done it, but we know that quite often we're seeing that people who we fire actually had previous misconduct. It wasn't just hearsay, this was often documented by previous employers. Often this misconduct is not picked up by police checks. So police checks are fairly widespread, but often behaviours, it's either not criminal or it's never investigated or proved to a criminal standard. So therefore it doesn't show up on police checks. And the big block here is that previous employers are reluctant to share data on previous misconduct. So I'd like to look at that in a bit more detail. So also just to highlight, this is a statement from, you might have seen the DFID safeguarding video that was shown at the start of the the 2018 conference. I find this an extremely powerful tool to highlight to your chief executives that actually this is a big problem. It's not one or two cases. For anyone to have the perception that you can't access support without having sex first, even a perception, that means that it must be fairly widespread. So we really need to challenge perceptions on that. Next slide, please. So why is data not being shared? Well, the main reason, as Sarah flagged, is legal. So people are really fearful, organisations are really fearful of being sued. Are we going to have legal problems? Are we going to have to hire lawyers and address this thing? And it's not an unjustified fear. We do know of agencies that do have these problems. But there's also a fear there, and again, Sarah mentioned this fear of blacklisting or discriminating against individual employees without sufficient justification. There's also a big challenge around the practical things. So people might be concerned, well, I don't want to share this because I'm not confident that we had solid evidence against abusers. And in actual fact, you very rarely have, by the very nature of the abuse, it's very difficult to get quality evidence. People might be concerned about the quality of their own processes. So, we know quite often managers don't manage these processes as well as possible. There's often gaps. And there's also concerns about the quality of documentation. What if I say this about next staff member and then we can't back it up with files of paper? And then, of course, there's the one that we just talked to earlier about the slow returns of reference checks and whether it might delay or block up recruitment. That comes up a lot as well. Next slide, please. One of the biggest challenges here is this issue of how we perceive risks. And Sarah made a great point on this about it's not just how we perceive risk to our organisations, but also how we perceive the risk to affected people. Because if you look at these risks on this little balance here, the risk of making checks, that's the risk that people see. Well, what if there's legal exposure? What if we get sued? What if we wrongly blacklist someone or we wrongly prevent someone having a job? And they're the ones that our lawyers see, that our HR people see. But there's a whole range of invisible risks that we don't weigh, even though if you look at them, huge reputational risk, huge financial risk. So for example, Save the Children has estimated that PSCA has cost them over $100 million in lost funding. So we're talking about huge risks there. But somehow we don't weigh these. We don't even see them quite often. So it's really important when you're kind of working through these issues to make sure you're thinking rationally about where the risks genuinely lie. Next slide, please. So how does the scheme address these issues? So first click, please. So first of all, the scheme's designed to provide legal reassurance as far as is possible. So one of the challenges we have is lawyers come to us and say, well, can you guarantee this, that checking, sharing data in the way the scheme describes is legal? And actually, it's virtually impossible to say, yes, it definitely is. We're pretty sure. GDPR, completely covered, there's no problem there. But on GDPR, for example, there's very little case law. It's relatively new legislation. It's been implemented in different ways in different countries. So it's very difficult. We can say kind of 95 to 99% we're sure, but we can't say 100%. Next click, please. So it focuses on providing better information. So part of the reason on my first slide I talked about it's not a yes, no, it's providing information for a better hiring decision. So that helps address this concern that maybe you're blacklisting people wrongly and takes you away from that space and gets you thinking about, actually, this is just about my hiring decision, of which this is one of many factors, and this helps us make a better decision. It also provides safety in numbers. So the idea is, and I've got the next slide will talk a little bit more about this, but it's people feel much more confident to do something if they know that others are doing it as well. It's our kind of herd mentality. So if we know that Oxfam, Save the Children, World Vision, and in terms of donors and UN agencies are doing this, it makes us a lot less nervous about doing it ourselves. It also provides a framework that avoids unnecessary detail. So one of the huge challenges on sharing this stuff is there's a tendency to say, oh, I want to know what were the details, what happened, where did the accusation come from? All these kind of questions that we see, for example, also from donors when we have an SEA case, that you don't need that detail. You just need to know, have there been issues? Has there been a concluded investigation? What are those kind of issues? And it also provides peer support. So it was interesting, I saw Ida, who I know well from my time in care, in the chat box, had mentioned that the peer network that the MDS provides gives you someone to check in a similar organisation to yours. There's also a couple of more points that I'd like to add that I don't think were on my slides, but Sarah's presentation flags on me. So one of the things it does is it provides a central reference point for all the implementing organisations. We have a registry on the website that tells you who you can go to check whether people have SEA on their records. That's an independent person. You can guarantee it's not a friend. You can guarantee it's an objective HR professional who's authorised to share that data. So that's useful. The other point, picking up from Sarah's presentation, was that it also, the scheme very strongly emphasises, it doesn't force you to, but it encourages you to talk very openly about the scheme, to include it on your adverts, to talk about it in your recruitment process. In some countries, this is legally required. For example, the Netherlands and Denmark, you have to ask an applicant's permission to make these checks. So you need to do it for legal reasons. But even where you don't, we encourage you to be open about that. Both because it means that your organisation remembers that it's doing it and tries to be more systematic, but also it means that anyone applying knows that you're making these checks, that you're doing it in a systematic way. Next slide, please. Yes, and finally, it provides evidence of impact, and I'll come to that in a second. So next slide, please. So what's it look like? People ask, well, what does misconduct data look like? This is just a screenshot from the template statement of conduct, and you can find this on our website. But you can see from the question 3, it's very, very top line. So was there statement? Yes, no, and importantly, the C option, I can't share. So again, that can't share, you might say, I can't share it because of these legal requirements, I can't share it because we didn't complete an investigation, you can share it because you can say we didn't document it properly, but that's still providing better information to make a better hiring decision. So it means that your counterpart in the hiring organisation can say, okay, we know that an investigation wasn't completed, that's probably raising some red flags, but we can talk about it in the interview. If this is a really strong candidate, we can follow up on that and make our own decision about whether we hire. Next slide, please. And the aim of all of this is to create this virtuous cycle. So we knew that this was something, we've tried to do this in the 90s, we tried to do it in the 2000s, both times it didn't get off the ground. And what we're trying to do is using the weight of the 9 SCHR members, who are all big NGOs, or their Red Cross, the Federation and the Committee of the Red Cross are both members. And we also had 6 other agencies who started. And the aim is you build up this scheme. So SCHR are already doing this. We've now been doing this for normally 2 years. That should encourage agencies to sign up to the scheme. We then get more evidence that it's making better hiring decisions, reducing the hiring of abusers. That then creates its own legal and practical case, because if you're worried about, can we make this number of checks? Well, if other agencies are already doing it, that's already reassuring that your agency can probably do it. And this builds up this, this cycle of increased evidence, increased people you can talk to about how you do it, and that builds that momentum until our hope is in the 3 or 4 years' time, it's just the norm. Everyone's doing this. Throughout this process, it's completely voluntary, but we would expect if we have kind of tens of thousands of checks being made every year, then your donors, your partners might well say, and your managers and your staff might well say, well, why aren't we doing this? If lots of other people are doing it successfully, then why aren't we doing it? Next slide, please. And in terms of the impact, and this was my point earlier, that we can demonstrate impact, we already know that by implementing the scheme, implementing agencies have prevented the hiring of 45 applicants who had misconduct on their file. So we know that it is working. I suspect we'll have much higher numbers when we get the 2020 data in January next year. So two things interesting about that. One is that we know that it's making us kind of these are people who we were just about to hire. We made these checks and then we changed our decision. But it also demonstrates that even in the current high-profile environment where we're talking about PSEA, we know there's a lot of focus on it, it's in the media with recent DRC cases, even with all that, people who have documented abuse on their HR file are still applying for jobs. And at the point that most of the data has come, these were all big household name NGOs like Oxfam, like Save the Children, like the Red Cross. We still had abusers with documented abuse. This isn't people who've never been caught. This is people with documented abuse on their file applying for jobs. So that just illustrates for me the height of the risk here. Next slide. So that's everything. You can find full details on the website. I know we've gone a little over time and I do want time to pick up some of the questions that I see in the chat. But thanks very much for the opportunity to share this and I look forward to the discussion. Over to you, Susanna.
Thank you so much, Gareth, for your presentation. Gareth just told us about the scheme address and also he showed us how it's very practical look like. We have few questions. The first question can goes for both of you, but you can choose who is going to answer. So the question is, another problem we have is that candidates often come with strong personal connection to our organization. So turning them down for legitimate background reason cause project leaders to doubt HR's vetting of candidates. In other words, the hiring manager trusts the friendship more than the background checking. So one of you can answer this question. Thank you. Gareth. Okay.
Yes, I'm happy to tackle that one. I think, again, this comes back to my little balance about the visible risks. I think one of the key things here, and it links back to your wider organizational culture, about how we communicate to managers these risks. So for the manager, their top priority is probably, how do I deliver this project? I've got to bang out all these outputs. I've got to consult with the community. I've got to do all these other things. I need those people to make that happen. When you highlight to them that their entire intended impact can be completely undermined by hiring the wrong person, hiring an abuser who's going to break trust with the community, who's going to undermine any good things you could do with your program, then that will hopefully make them think again and realize why this is important. Secondly, it's about having trust in those processes. And again, if you can demonstrate that you're part of an established process that's systematically checked, then I think that also helps build confidence.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. We have another question. This can also can be for both of you, but this time Sarah can answer. The question is, recruitment check should be across the board. It would be a mistake. So to think that only male staff are potential sexual perpetrator. Research is shown that it's women who broker earlier marriages of younger refugee children or online abuse or recruit women girls for sex trafficking. Did I get? Recruitment checks should be across the board. It would be a mistake to think that only male staff to be potential sex perpetrators. Research has shown that is women who broker early marriage of young refugee children or online abuse, or recruit women and girls for sex trafficking. Is that clear?
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that question. And I don't think anyone is saying that you only apply your recruitment diligence to men. I mean, yes, we do know that the vast majority of perpetrators are male, but of course, if you're going to do something, as Gareth was saying, if you're going to do something as standard, well, then you do it to everybody, and it becomes what you do on a routine basis. So you know, thanks for the question, because there was clearly a misunderstanding there. I just wanted to go back a little, if I can, to the previous question, and to really underscore how important it is to educate people working in country offices, people working on projects, chiefs of party, team leaders, and to let them, to really give them the information that this is their job. It's their job as well to prevent their team recruiting on a contact base, or a sort of, you know, familial or network base. And I think really to underscore also something about, to say to them, the risk is, if the risk is the organisation or the risk is for the beneficiaries, but the risk is also you, my friend's personal reputation. If you are known to be the one who recruited a perpetrator, then that's not going to be good for you and your own network in your country. Hope that answers both of those.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. The third question is for Gareth. Is there a plan to set up the scheme to cover the national staffs and in each country context?
Yes, so the intention with the scheme is that it's applicable to all staff across all your operations everywhere. One of the things that has happened is that because people, again, as we're going around this cycle of building confidence and building kind of ability to do it, rollout's generally been staged between different elements of confederations and different parts of organisations. But the intent is that the scheme is pretty simple to implement. So small national organisations can do it. In fact, it's often easier for smaller organisations to implement because they have smaller HR databases, they have smaller numbers of recruitments coming through. But yeah, so the idea is that the scheme is implementable by any organisation. And even, you know, you don't necessarily have to even formally kind of sign up to the scheme. You can just implement it. It's all publicly available templates. And the scheme also has a huge amount of flexibility as well. So you can incorporate this template statement of conduct that I shared in the slide into your existing reference checks. So there's plenty of flexibility there about how you do it.
Okay, the next question also is for you, Grace. A problem I find is that some of the cases of C have not investigated or documented properly. So even if you contacted the HR and not the reference given by the candidate, there is no information in the database or on the HR file.
Yeah, so that's one of the real limitations of the scheme, is that it's designed really to pick up people who do have at least some level of documented kind of misconduct. So that won't pick up people who have no record of misconduct. But however, you know, as Sarah highlighted, most of these people are repeat offenders. You know, we're trying to pick up that specific case. And even if you don't have, you know, quite often organisations will struggle to properly document abuse. They'll feel nervous about putting it on file. Quite often we find out that organisations have informal blacklists, or they have kind of notes on HR files which say we didn't have formal allegations, we didn't investigate, so we didn't take disciplinary action, but we do have a note on the file that says actually there's been some red flags here. The scheme allows you to share that, and again, it's in the interest of not giving you a yes/no, but it's about sharing better information to make a better hiring decision. So the scheme, and you saw the format, it gives you the scope to say, we can't share anything concrete because we don't have it formally on the file, but there's something here you should probably just check into when you're making your recruitment decision. And that, we find, is probably enough to protect affected people and your organisation.
Okay.
Susanna, can I just also add to this that,
Please.
as Gareth says, you don't need to be a member of the scheme. The format of the scheme is a tool to be used. And you can add to it. So for instance, for a lot of US-based organizations, a simple question of, is this person eligible for rehire in your organization? That makes people trip up to say, they have to say, yes, we would rehire this person in a heartbeat. And when they can't say that, then you've got your red flags. And I think somebody mentioned in the chat how important it is to try where you can, where resources allow, to have phone conversations about reference checking, because you can often pick up something from somebody who sort of hesitates, and then you've got a way of talking to people more clearly. But you know, the misconduct disclosure scheme isn't the only thing. You know, we need, like we said or people said in the answers to the polls, a speak up culture, so that people, community members and staff, feel able and supported to come forward with reservations or negative curiosity about other people. So it's not just this one thing, it's a package.
Thank you, Sarah. You have another question, Sarah, for you. Top one for me is the speed at which some consultants are needed to be deployed. Often you are using a small pool of known colleagues, and they need fast deployment. The client and the project team rarely wants to wait the reference or waiting to come back.
Yeah, this is a really important problem. I think for larger organizations, this should be, in a way, this should be less of a problem, because where you have a recruitment team who's building up a database, then as you go out and you get people's CVs, their resumes, you can also start getting their references. And so you're building up a body of knowledge about a person. And yeah, we all do it. I always think recruitment is a bit like a wardrobe. You only ever use 20%. And so you know more about those people than you think you do. And again, pushing recruitment decisions and responsibility down to people on projects, people in the hiring teams, people in the business development sections, so that it becomes normalized for people to be inquisitive about the prospective employee's history.
Thank you, Sarah. The final question is for Gareth. The disclosure scheme, is that only referred to C or also sexual harassment?
Yes, so it does include harassment. I'm just also responding to some of the questions via chat, so that hopefully we can answer a few more. But yeah, so it does cover harassment. We quite often get asked whether it covers other forms of misconduct, for example, financial and other misconduct. It doesn't, and that was a specific reason to focus on this particular problem. But yes, it does cover harassment as well. I see there's several questions around the legal framework. So there are quite robust answers to that on our website. But just to say, it's completely GDPR compliant. There are some specific challenges. I saw there was a question about Germany. There are some specific challenges to that, and I'll try and answer them in the chat. But we've had no lawsuits at all, despite thousands of checks, and hopefully in January I'll be able to say tens of thousands of checks being made. So we are pretty confident in our legal analysis here, that it is entirely legal. But again, I would refer back to the weighing scale. The actual invisible risk of enabling abuse by hiring abusers is much, much greater than the risk of any kind of privacy or employment law lawsuit that you might face. But as I say, none so far.
Okay, thank you so much. We have like 2 minutes or 1 minute. If you have any additions, I will give you for both of you, Sarah and Gareth. Then we will close. If you have any final remark.
Thanks. I would just reiterate really the thing about risk, and I'm just looking at one person's question. Is there a chance the scheme may be abused by agencies who have a personal vendetta against a candidate? who maybe let them down on a project. There's something that a friend of mine calls the whataboutery, that you can always think of something to say, oh well, maybe we shouldn't. But I think I refer everybody back to Gareth's balance of the risks, and also just to be really clear that from the beginning, when you start to talk to somebody about joining your organization or being rehired by your organization or moving around the same organization, that you say to people, you know, this is who we are. We are trying to protect the people we work for. You support that, don't you? And so you're building in a yes, if you like, to people saying, yes, of course I'm happy for you to go to my references. Of course I'm happy for you to ask people if I've been investigated. Of course I'm happy to tell you what the gaps are on my CV. Of course I am, because I know that you share my value of safe recruitment.
Thank you, Sarah. Gareth?
Yeah, so for me, I see a lot of the questions are around the kind of practical elements, and I see some of them have been answered by other attendees. But yeah, so we get a lot of concern about, will this slow our hiring? Will it, you know, so a couple of answers there. One is that make your contracts, offer your contracts, employ the person, but make them conditional on health, on PSEA checks coming back, same as most of our agencies do on health checks. So then you know, if something does come back negative, you're clear, you can say, no, actually, you're not the right candidate for this role, and we'll take you out. The other thing is also just to try, and again, it's about this weighing scale of risk. Yes, there might be a slight risk, and it is pretty small, that you delay your recruitment. But when you compare that to the risk that you hire an abuser and the problems that will cause you, the damage it will do to both affected people and your response, it's quite an easy balance to work out. And one of the things that, you know, I'm proud of the scheme in that we are gathering that data, so that we can say, actually, look, the scheme's already prevented 45 abusers getting into posts where they'd have a power position that would enable them to commit abuse. I mean, that's really concrete. You can go to your chief executive if he's not convinced, or you can go to your program manager if they're not convinced, and say, well, we know this scheme in its first year when it was just getting going. I expect these numbers to be much higher in January, February when we publish the 2020 numbers, and say, look, this is really concrete. 45 people who big INGOs would have hired into positions of power, they didn't hire because they made these simple checks. And I find that a fairly compelling argument for anyone who's a bit skeptical or a bit nervous.
Thank you so much. That's all we have time for today. Thank you again for our speakers, Sarah and Gareth. I want to thank you also the attendees. It was a very live discussion. We will share the presentation and also the recording, and with that, we may share you also the FCDO questionnaire. We want to learn from you how much this webinar is helping, and we will be sharing a poll with you at the end of this webinar. Please do complete it. It helps us to tailor our service to suit you. Thank you so much again.